He's devoted much of his life to diplomacy. Ban Ki-moon joined South Korea's Foreign Service in 1970, and since then he's worked and travelled the world. Ban began his successful diplomatic career in New Delhi before ending up in multiple posts from Seoul to Washington to Vienna. In 2004, Ban Ki-moon served as South Korea's foreign minister until 2006, when he declared his candidacy to replace Kofi Annan as the head of the United Nations. The General Assembly elected him as the 8th Secretary General in October that year, beginning his term in January 2007. The challenges he faced were many, from Iran and North Korea's nuclear programs to conflicts in the Middle East and the threat of global warming. Some of the main objectives the UN achieved during Ban's tenure include setting up the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and the creation of UN Women, an entity working for women's empowerment. After 2 terms, Ban left office and was replaced by Antonio Guterres in 2017, but many of the issues he faced still remain. So what can the United Nations do to have a bigger impact and affect global change? In his new book, Resolved: United Nations in a Divided World, Ban reflects on the role of his former organisation in today's multifaceted society facing many challenges. The former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, talks to Al Jazeera. Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the United Nations, now the Deputy Chair of the Elders. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. You have a new book out. We'll come to that in a moment. But first, let me take you back to the end of your decade as the Secretary General of the UN. You were Secretary General right up until the end of 2016. Some people might say you dodged a bit of a bullet by the date of your departure, because your successor, Antonio Guterres, took office on the 1st of January. He only had 20 days before another important world leader took office, the leader of the most powerful economy on earth, and that was Donald J. Trump. He was someone who didn't really agree much with international cooperation. Some might say he didn't agree with the UN system. Are you relieved you didn't have to deal with President Trump?
In that regard, personally speaking, I was relieved because I was not supposed to deal with him. But what had happened during President Trump's 4 years' time, as a former Secretary General, I was deeply concerned about the multilateralism in disarray. Most of the important international agreements have been cancelled during his time. First of all, climate change agreement, which took almost 20 years, longer than 20 years since Kyoto Protocol, has been almost ruined by the withdrawal of the United States. And the US also withdrew from JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, to deal with the Iranian nuclear issues. And there were a lot of such multilateralism which have been in disarray. I am very much relieved and happy that Joe Biden has been elected and returned to Paris Climate Change Agreement. And now US is seriously negotiating with the Iranians for returning to JCPOA. And there are also many other areas in world trade systems which have been also hampered by the lack of spirit of multilateralism.
Do you think there's lasting damage from the Trump era? And did you ever fear that perhaps he might pull out of the UN completely, and that could affect the whole future of the United Nations?
I didn't think that they would dare to consider withdrawing from the United Nations itself. But it is true that I have been very much concerned. Then, as a former Secretary General, I was invited to many international forums, international conferences, small and big. Each time I have been speaking out that President Trump's vision was politically very short-sighted, and morally wrong. When it comes to climate change, he was scientifically very much wrong, and economically also irresponsible. And I told and warned the world that he may be standing in the wrong side of the history. I can tell you that I have done my utmost efforts, and I've been working tirelessly with the world leaders so that the world leaders can demonstrate their global citizenship, their leadership based on global citizenship. And at this time, I do not see many leaders, global leaders, who really act genuinely as global leaders based on global citizenship.
You say in your new memoir, populist bullies are perhaps the least effective diplomats. I suspect that might be a reference to President Trump. Let's look at one example, someone you know so well because you were a veteran South Korean diplomat rising to be the foreign minister before you became Secretary General. I want to ask you about recent developments on the Korean Peninsula during the Trump era. There were 3 face-to-face meetings between President Trump and Kim Jong-Un. Very unusual diplomacy took place. Is the world a safer place?
Of course, he was the first United States president who met North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and also he was the first United States president who had stepped on the territory of North Korea, even though it was very brief. In that regard, there was most heightened expectation that U.S. president would be able to agree on a very concrete agreement with North Koreans to make denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Particularly when I'm saying that about North Korea. North Korea is the only country, first and the only country in 21st century who have tested 6 times nuclear bombs. And they have also tested the intercontinental ballistic missiles, long range and short range, and they are also developing submarine-based nuclear weapons, etc. Therefore, we had much expectation, but in the end, his sort of reality show type diplomacy has made a lot of Koreans and the people of peace-loving people very much disappointed. Now, the current situation on the Korean Peninsula is also very much worrisome. We have to make sure that during President Biden's era, that there should be a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
North Korea is a place with an appalling human rights record. When you were Secretary General, you used to talk a lot about human rights up front, but it's pretty clear that human rights abuses are growing around the world, and some of the most powerful countries on earth are involved. I give you 2 examples. For example, the Uyghur people in China, a permanent member of the Security Council responsible for what some say is genocide, and Syria, where human rights groups all agree that Russia has joined the Assad regime in abuses, including targeting medical facilities. You were Secretary General. How hard is it for a Secretary General to confront these sort of problems when they're carried out by the most powerful countries?
There are, of course, abuses of human rights violators in this world. Now, because of the divisions among big powers, particularly the permanent members of the Security Council, Big Five, then nothing could have been agreed upon to deal with the human rights. For example, in the case of Syria, 6.6 million Syrians have become refugees here and there in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt, and elsewhere. I have visited all these places, but Security Council has not been able to agree on anything, even on purely, genuinely humanitarian issues, because of the veto power. Then I think who should be blamed on this? It's only the people. Then I have been speaking out that the justice will prevail for those perpetrators of violators of human rights and justice, then I've been speaking out that justice will prevail, if not today, tomorrow. If not tomorrow, surely in the near future. That is what International Criminal Court and other judiciary bodies and special court which I have been established during my time has been working. But unfortunately, we have not seen much progress in this.
You mentioned Syria, and there is an intriguing reference in your new book. It says, if the UN had been allowed to take a larger role earlier in the Syrian war, I believe Europe would not now be grappling with their own refugee crisis. What role did you want the UN to take, and who stopped you?
I have been speaking to al-Bashar Assad of Syria many times, but he's been lying all the time, so therefore then I appointed my predecessor Kofi Annan, then Lakhdar Brahimi, and many able diplomats. But all these negotiations have not yielded any success, any result, because of the division among P5, permanent members of the Security Council. That is why many member states are now arguing that there should be reform of the Security Council. But it is, after all, their decision. Decision is in the hands of 5 permanent members. Therefore, while the reform of the Security Council has been on the agenda many years, many decades now, we have not been able to make any progress. I am really very much frustrated about this kind of a situation. I am urging, as a former Secretary General, and also my successor, Antonio Guterres, who will be reappointed soon, then I think the United Nations should really speak out on the matters of principled human rights and human dignity.
Well, one of those matters is a country that has deteriorated greatly this year in terms of its situation, one where you worked for a very long time, and that's Myanmar, where there was a coup on the 1st of February. You spoke in the Security Council, a powerful call to action in April. You said there was a fleeting moment for strong action to stop the atrocities. Nothing's been done. Do you fear that fleeting moment has now passed?
In my report to the Security Council on April 19th, I suggested to the members of the Security Council to consider even the process of invoking responsibility to protect, as we did in 2011 in the case of Libya. Of course, this will be met, I'm afraid to say that, by the veto power. But if there are tools, there are regimes which we can apply to address all this unacceptable situation, but the member states of the United Nations, particularly security, they are not, they are divided, completely divided. And therefore, I'm really urging, first of all, it's an issue among the ASEAN. So ASEAN leaders should take a much, much stronger action. I myself offered my own visit to meet Myanmar military coup leader, but they replied that the timing was not convenient for them. But when there would be convenient time for me to visit? Because nothing has been happened. It is the people who will suffer from all this military dictatorship.
You mention the problems in the Security Council, and again, it comes back to the dysfunction in the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. With regard to Myanmar, with regard to Tigray and Ethiopia, there seems to be no appetite for any sort of punitive action, arms embargo, sanctions from Russia and China. Potentially, though, as you move forward, if these 2 countries aren't going to support sanctions, and we know that they're not under UN sanctions, but both countries are under EU and US sanctions, doesn't increasingly the Security Council become more and more toothless, and then the UN itself become more irrelevant?
It's not toothless. In fact, it has become toothless, but they have teeth, very strong power and tools to solve the problems, to solve unacceptable human rights issues and violations of principles and ideals of the international United Nations Charter. In the case of Tigray, I'm again deeply concerned that this is now being perpetuated by the country where the leader is a Nobel Peace Laureate. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was awarded Nobel Peace Laureate just a couple of years ago. Now these are 6.6 million people in Tigray. I think they are suffering a lot because of, first of all, lack of food, lack of water, and there's always military actions. I am again asking African Union, they have quite efficient way of making decisions, but they have not yet taken in a collective way.
In recent weeks, we've seen another conflict in the Middle East, the bombardment of Gaza, rockets fired by Hamas. You have seen this before several times when you were the Secretary General. I was in the region recently. I've been visiting for 30 years. I spoke to quite a few Palestinian people, and there's absolutely no hope left among these people. What is to be done?
This 11-day war between Israel and Hamas was really terrible. And it reminded me of my time when I had to deal with such kind of Israeli bombing, which had been mostly provoked by Hamas all the times. But I know that all this had been provoked by Hamas and returned by Israelis. But the magnitude of returning all this crisis was not rational, first of all. It also reminded me of my own diplomatic engagement in January 2009. It started late December 2008, but I was on the road and I was on a so-called conveyor belt diplomacy. I was visiting at least 4 countries a day, meeting leaders of 4 countries.
Secretary General, should the current Secretary General be doing that because he didn't leave New York?
Well, that's his job, and I do not have any comment about this. I have been speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu all the times. Then there is a saying that you can have choice of everything as a human being. You can have a choice of your friends, whom to meet or whom to not meet. Even you can have a choice of your own spouse. If you don't like, then each can divorce. But when it comes to geographical neighbor, you have no choice. You have to live as long as this planet Earth continues. This is what I have been saying. Therefore, I am urging now next Prime Minister, Mr. Bennett seems to be next to Prime Minister of Israel, and he should sit down together with President Mahmoud Abbas of Palestinian Authority. There are all the agendas on the table. It's a matter of choice. There are many Security Council resolutions, numerous Security Council resolutions, and there is Oslo Agreement, and there is Abraham Accord.
Yeah, but Secretary General, sorry to interrupt you there. They all refer to a 2-state solution, but just the situation on the ground now, where is the viable Palestinian state? It's already been built all over.
Now, Palestinians, of course, they are not solidly unified, but when they are under oppression, under such a hugely difficult human situation, it's only natural that they are not united. Then Israel as a bigger and more powerful country, they should be more compassionate. I have declared while visiting Israel, I think I'm the only Secretary General who has been publicly stating that Israel has, I appreciate the genuine security concern of Israel. That was very much appreciated by Israelis because nobody was speaking out about Israel's own security concern. It's a genuine. So we fully appreciate that kind of genuine. That does not give any right to destroy all this settlement and unconditional bombings with much super military power. And therefore, they should sit down together. There are many options are already available. And there are many countries who are really willing to support two-state solutions. Now, with all this Israelis having diplomatic relationship with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan, and Morocco, and the Middle East region, I think this is a good opportunity for Israelis also to be genuinely compassionate and try to resolve this once and for all, for a lasting peace, so that Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security side by side.
As a reporter who covers international affairs and is based at UN headquarters, I witnessed many of the events you did, and I appreciate from reading the book your viewpoint on them. But I'll have to be honest with you, there is one part of the book, one section of the book I found rather jarring, and that's when you refer to Haiti. And as you know, there was an earthquake there, and then the UN peacekeepers brought cholera. And yet you say of the court case that was brought against the UN, I thought this lawsuit was fraudulent from the beginning, and I was incensed every time I thought about this attempt to extort money from the United Nations. Surely these were just people who had been victims of the United Nations trying to get some justice.
United Nations also lost 102 staff and soil peacekeepers. And it was the United Nations, under my leadership, who have been genuinely and persistently trying to help Haitian people. Unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of people have been contaminated by cholera virus.
Yes, and just to interrupt you for a second, you did the right thing and set up a fund for those people, but it's woefully underfunded. No money is going to these victims. So can you not understand why they'd want to take out a court case? My last report to this General Assembly on Haiti was early December of my last month, 2016. And I appealed that we need to mobilize some fundings. That was not a big money, but member states were not willing to show their sincere support for Haitian people. At the same time, Haitian leadership, they were divided among themselves. That was also one of my source of dissatisfaction and regret, that there is a saying that heaven helps those who help themselves, but they were not really united. Starting from the present. That was what I was very much sorry to witness myself as a Secretary General. Member states have not shown much support for Haiti. That's one of my regrets. And that is one area that because of this earthquake and after reconstruction process, United Nations has been blamed sometimes in an unfair way. But I'm ready to receive that kind of criticism. Your new memoir, looking back on your life's work, is called Resolved. But looking forward, many of the world's conflicts and problems are not resolved. Can I ask you how you see the future, how you see the future world your grandchildren will live in? Are you hopeful?
when United Nations member states are not solidly united, that is the problem now. Then there is no way for any, however able Secretary General one may be, and then not a single individual or country can do it alone. We should put all our hands on the deck together.
Former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Shukran jazilan.